All right. Hello again, everybody. I hope we're all doing really well. Today, we are going to talk about the ontological argument for God's existence, or ontological arguments, plural. So, kind of like last couple times, we were talking about two versions of the cosmological argument. This time, we're going to be talking about two versions of the ontological argument. Okay. So, what is an ontological argument as opposed to a cosmological argument? Biggest difference is that the cosmological arguments are in some sense reliant upon empirical matters, right? So cosmological arguments do things like identify contingency. They make claims about the existence of the universe. When did the universe exist? Did or has the universe always existed? We're looking at the external world in some sense and drawing conclusions about the existence of God. Okay. With ontological arguments, we're not doing that. We're not looking at anything empirical. We're just looking at definitions and claims and deducing God's existence from concepts. This is what we might call an a priori argument. So this is an argument that does not have to do or not have anything to do with the senses, whereas the cosmological argument is an a posteriori argument. That means it has to do with the senses, right? We're not just using reason, we're using reason and empirical experience. Whereas a priori things in the ontological argument, we use reason alone in order to draw conclusions about God's nature. Okay, so this is the Anselmian ontological argument, named after Saint Anselm. He is one of these great 13th century philosophers. He is a saint in the Catholic Church. And the story is that one day he was praying in his cell to understand, to have understanding about God. And all at once, this argument came to him. It just kind of was zapped into his mind, and he wrote it down immediately. And so we have, the tradition goes, we have God to thank for the ontological argument. So interesting stuff. So like all the other arguments, we're going to take this one premise by premise and talk about each premise. Presumably you've already read The Wood, so you kind of have an understanding of what's going on here. But we'll look at each premise in painful detail. Keep your mind on the conclusion. Okay, what are we trying to work towards? We are working towards God exists in reality, right? God exists in the robust way, the controversial way. Okay, so let's move on. Let's see. Okay. So by the term God, what we mean is the being than which no greater can be thought. Okay. So the term God, what does that term mean? Well, it means the greatest thing, the greatest being that we could ever conceive of ever in a million years. Okay. So we can look at the external world around us. All of the things that we see have varying degrees of perfections, right? Given what those things are, right? So think about a leopard. A leopard has varying degrees of perfection, the standard of which is leopard perfection, right? So it can run fast, it can kill its prey very easily. And if it does those things well, we would say that we have a leopard with a high degree of perfections, right? Okay, so we think about all of the attributes that we're drawn to, that we're attracted to, right? Creative power, um, mercy, love, all of these things. We humans have all of these attributes, right? Um, Intellect, right? So what God is the being that holds all of those attributes to their maximal degree, right? Uh, Perfectly knowing, right? Perfectly powerful, all of these things. Um, so God has all of these attributes that we are drawn to, that are perfect making attributes, and has them also to the perfect degree, right? Okay, so if God has all of those things, right? Attributes, perfect attributes to their perfect degrees, right? Um, then that means that we can't conceive of any other being that's greater than God, right? Um, God is that being than which nothing else, no greater being can be conceived. Okay. Premise two. The being than which no greater can be thought, i.e., God, exists in the understanding. Okay, yeah, okay. So what does it mean to exist in the understanding? Well, to exist in the understanding means that you have some notion of what it is to be a certain thing, right? We have, so what else exists in the understanding? A unicorn exists in the understanding, right? If I use the word unicorn and you hear unicorn, you're going to think to yourself, "Oh, it's a horse-like shaped creature with a horn protruding from its forehead," right? Okay, so you have a conception of what a unicorn is. In a similar way, you have the conception of what a book is. Now, the way a book and the way that a unicorn are different is that books exist both in the understanding and in reality, whereas unicorns exist merely in the understanding, right? So we can say, yeah, unicorns do exist, but they exist in the understanding, right? Okay, so the claim here is that God, we can say for sure, exists in the understanding, right? I use the word God, or I use the words the being than which no greater can be thought, and you have that concept in your brain of God and that being than which no greater can be conceived or thought, um, and so we can say that God exists at the very least in the understanding, right? So we can imagine and understand a being that has a maximal degree of every good, right? Um, okay. So premise three. It is possible that God exists in reality as well as the understanding. So remember, we talked about the book, right? The book exists both in the understanding and in external reality. Okay, so so all premise three is saying is that it's possible that God exists, right? Um, God could exist. God may not exist, but God could exist, right? So, well, what's an example of something that could never exist? Consider the following: a married bachelor. A married bachelor will never exist. Well, why is that? Well, because it's a logical impossibility, right? To be a bachelor is, by definition, to be unmarried, right? And to be married, well, if you're married, then you cease to be a bachelor, right? So if you were a married bachelor, you're a contradiction, right? Um, that's the that's the claim here. You can't be in a position of being both married and unmarried simultaneously, right? So we would say that it's impossible that there exists a married bachelor. Now, you see, God, the premise three is claiming that God is not like that. God is, um, God is something that could possibly exist in reality, as opposed to a married bachelor, which could never exist in reality. All right. Okay, premise 4. This is the really fun premise. Okay, it is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the understanding. Okay, so Anselm is coming out of this tradition that says that that identifies varying degrees of perfection, right? So we've already kind of talked a little bit about this. So we might say that God enjoys a greater degree of perfection rather than I do, right? Because I don't have divine attributes, right? But I enjoy a degree of perfection greater than a leopard or greater than a teapot, right? And it's because, well, why? Well, because why is the leopard greater than the teapot? Well, the leopard can perceive, it can move on its own agency, it can eat, it can do all of these things that the pot can't, right? The teapot can't. So I enjoy a greater degree of perfection than the leopard, in part because I can reason, I can think about stuff, I can do all of these other things in addition to seeing and moving and doing things of my own volition, right? Okay, so the idea here is that things that exist that actually exist enjoy some degree of perfection, like a step above things that don't exist in reality, right? So horses are greater than unicorns. Well, why is that? Horses enjoy actual existence, right? They enjoy existing both in the understanding and in reality, whereas unicorns merely enjoy existence in the understanding. Okay. So we might say that, suppose I have an imaginary horse, Ralph, and then I have a real horse, Jerry, right? Jerry enjoys much more perfection than Ralph, right? Okay. Okay, so here's a problem. Um, suppose you had to choose between two different things, right? You could choose between a piece of chalk dust, right? Just a little grain of chalk just there. Or you could choose between that and uninterrupted imagination of or a fantasizing about your favorite vacation, right? Or your favorite holiday. Okay. Well, we might say that we might prefer the imagination, right? Imagining about my favorite holiday for 15 minutes than possessing like a single piece of dust. Okay, that seems fair. Okay, so it doesn't always seem that like imaginary things are always greater than actually existent things. Okay, so maybe this premise is like running into a problem. Okay, um, well, the comparison is just a little bit off, right? It seems doesn't seem fair to say that, to compare something like a vacation with something like a piece of dust, right? So one thing we might do is we might compare the imaginary vacation to an actual vacation. That is, the actual vacation seems to enjoy a much greater degree of perfection than the imaginary vacation. And we might, therefore, choose the actual vacation over the imaginary one, right? Um, so Wood talks about comparing apples and oranges, right? So it might be that we're comparing apples and oranges when we're talking about the piece of chalk dust and the imaginary vacation. All right. So suppose that God exists only in the understanding. Okay, so premise 5 is doing something really weird here, and we need to talk about it. And we're going to talk about it more in the next section on ethics. Okay, so premise 5 is not saying that God exists only in the understanding, right? It's not saying that uh, God doesn't exist in reality. It's not saying God exists only in the understanding. It's saying, let's just pretend that God only exists in the understanding, or let's make an assumption, right? Um, let's just pretend, or let's just suppose for the sake of argument that God only exists in the understanding, right? Okay. So this is an assumption or a pretending or a supposition that we are assuming for reductio. Okay, so a reductio ad absurdum is an argument style in which we assume something to be true, okay? And then we see what follows from it if it were true, not that it is true, right? We're saying if this were true, here are the things that would follow from it, right? And if those things are absurd or if they're contradictions, then we see that the original thing that we assumed is false. Okay, so premise 5 here, we're making an assumption that God only exists in the understanding. Now, Anselm's goal is going to be to derive a contradiction or an absurdity from premise 5 in order to show that God exists in reality as well as the understanding. Um, Good. So premise 5, when you see premise 5, just know that it's an assumption that we are going to reject in the conclusion of the argument. All right. So if God only exists in the understanding, that is, if premise 5 is true, well, then God might have been greater than God is. Okay, that's a little harebrained. Right. So let's suppose that God doesn't exist in reality. So God is just existent in our imaginations. Well, that means that God could be greater, right? Um, that means that God could be better than God actually is. Well, why is that? Well, because existing in reality is greater than existing merely in the understanding. So if God doesn't exist in reality, that means that God could be greater, right? Okay. But if God could be greater than God is, right? So we're looking at the consequent of premise 7. If God could be greater, or the consequent of premise 6, if God could be greater than God is, then the being than which a greater cannot be thought is a being than which a greater can be thought, which is a contradiction. So if you're going to say that, okay, if God can be greater than God, then that means the being than which no greater can be conceived is a being which greater can be conceived, right? And so there's a contradiction right there, right? So what do we mean by God? We mean the greatest thing that we could ever imagine. Okay, if God can be greater than God, that means the greatest thing we can imagine uh, can be shown to be greater, right? You see how there's a contradiction there. There's some tension there, um, right? So the idea here is that God, in order to be the like the the greatest that we can conceive, right? It has to be the case that God exists in reality, right? All right, so this gives us a reason to reject premise 5, right? So premise 8 is the rejection of premise 5 that we suppose. So it is therefore false that God exists only in the understanding, right? Um, and it follows from that that God must exist in reality as well as the understanding. So this is a super weird argument, right? That really just turns on the definition of what we mean by God. This is a big deal, right? And a lot of ink has been spilled over this argument too. So let's see. So let's try and take this argument and put it on the fire a little bit. Okay, consider the perfect island objection. So I've construed the perfect island objection to at least somewhat mirror the ontological argument for God's existence. So by the term perfect island, it is meant the island than which no greater can be thought, right? So that's meant to mirror. By the term God, it is meant the being than which no greater can be thought, right? So imagine the perfect island. Okay, we can totally imagine the very perfect island. Okay. Well, we can imagine the perfect island, right? Okay. Well, what makes it the very perfect island? Well, if it's going to be the greatest island that we could ever conceive, well, that means that it actually has to exist in reality as well as the understanding, right? Uh, so, so the idea is that, well, the perfect island must actually exist in reality. Well, it turns out the perfect island does not exist in reality, right? So we have the same argument just changed around just a little bit, right? And we see that the argument leads us to a false conclusion, namely that the perfect island must exist in reality, in which case it doesn't, right? So there's a lot to be said about this objection. Wood talks about this objection a little bit. I want to pose it to you guys. I want to see you guys write on this topic. How might the defender of the Anselmian ontological argument defend that argument against this argument? What makes this argument different from the argument that we just looked at, the ontological argument? So that's something to think about, and I'll post a writing assignment relatively soon, like on this stuff in particular. But go back and look at the Wood, and next time we're going to do modal ontological arguments for God's existence.